There is trouble in our democracy of late, and not the good kind John Lewis talked about. When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? That's the opening couplet from the inaugural poem, The Hill We Climb, which we heard nearly a year ago from Amanda Gorman on that chilly January morning at the Capitol. Gorman reminded us, somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. We've never been a perfect union. We always strive to become a more perfect union. We keep striving. We keep working to be better. The Senate is preparing to vote on the voting rights bill soon. It's a bill that puts limits on gerrymandering, tightens restrictions on financial contributions from hidden sources, and increases access for voters, particularly minority voters, through measures including automatic voter registration systems, fewer restrictions on mail-in ballots, and making Election Day a national holiday so working people have a better chance to participate. It was Gandhi who said the true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable members. How well are we doing on that count? Are we protecting the vulnerable? Are we looking out for the marginalized among us? The House of Representatives passed the bill. It is, however, expected to die by filibuster in the Senate. The vote's been put off until this coming week, hoping perhaps a few more senators can discover their moral backbones. In his 1957 speech, Give Us the Ballot, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. offered this searing analysis of the situation back then on how the federal government was rendering itself impotent on the issue of voting rights back then in 57. He said, this dearth of positive leadership from the federal government is not confined to one particular political party. Both political parties have betrayed the cause of justice. The Democrats have betrayed it by capitulating to the prejudices and undemocratic practices of the Southern Dixiecrats. The Republicans have betrayed it by capitulating to the blatant hypocrisy of right-wing reactionary Southerners. These men so often have high blood pressure of words and an anemia of deeds. And here we are again, 65 years later, the landscape is changed, but the issues continue and democracy remains in trouble today. As a faith community, Unitarian Universalists are committed to the principle of democracy. For decades, we have included democracy in our official statement of religious identity, our principles and purposes. The wording, even back in the 1960s of our original merger principles, says we unite in seeking the use of the democratic method in human relations. Later, in the current version from the 1980s, which we still use today, it says we affirm and promote the right of conscience and the use of the democratic method, the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. In short, we see the use of democracy not only as a political issue. For us, it is a matter of moral importance as well. Free and fair voting access is the fundamental aspect of a functional democracy. It was Susan B. Anthony who declared that suffrage is a pivotal right. This matters to us politically as citizens, and this matters to us morally as people of faith. We recognize that religious interests must include moral interests in the workings of the nation. As Professor Samuel Thomas said in our reading about the prophet Amos this morning, quote, religious devotion is meaningless if it is accompanied by unfair taxes on the poor, backdoor bribes, and working against those in need. Lest you think that Professor Thomas is kind of adding something to what Amos said, you think that perhaps he's updating concepts, not only paraphrasing words. Let me tell you what Amos said 2,500 years ago. You levy a straw tax on the poor and impose a tax on their grain. For I know how many of your offenses and how many are your offenses and how great are your sins. There are those who oppose and oppress the innocent and take bribes and deprive the poor of justice in the courts. It's important to give access to the means of change to all the people. So while there are those in power now attempting to suppress access and deny a voice to the marginalized among us, we do well to remember that our faith, and indeed many of the faiths represented in our nation, call us to do the exact opposite. Our faith, and indeed many of the faiths in our nation, call us to care for all the people in the nation, not just some. My title for today's sermon is a reference to a series of parables in the Gospel of Matthew. And it's also a direct line from the American politician and voting rights activist, Stacey Abrams. Abrams was part of the 2021 Ware Lecture this past summer. The Ware Lecture is an annual prestigious event at our UUA General Assembly. The shared lecture this summer focused on voter suppression and voting rights. Abrams talked about her work helping people at that point get vaccinated. She talked about how the people she tended to be helping were the last in line to receive support and the first in line to receive punishment. She noticed how often her constituents were the last and the lost and the least. Abrams spoke stirringly about growing up with lessons her parents gave to her and her siblings. She said her parents and the children had 3 jobs: go to church, go to school, and take care of others, she said. She and her siblings were regularly serving at soup kitchens and homeless shelters and prisons to help those in need. Her parents would remind them that no matter how little they had as a family, there was always someone who had less. And our job, her parents said, was to serve whoever had less. The last, the lost, and the least. In chapter 20 of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus declared the last will be first and the first will be last. This is paired with the parable of the workers in the vineyard. A little earlier in chapter 18, Jesus said, if any man has 100 sheep and one of them is gone astray, does he not leave the 99 in the mountains and go search for the one that is straying? This parable of the lost sheep. Then a little later in Matthew, Jesus tells the parable of the sheep and the goats, in which the character of the king proclaims, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. In the span of just a few chapters in this gospel, the message arises again and again, the message that we are to care for the last, the lost, and the least. The message that God cares for them and that we are to do so as well. I am aware that among traditional interpretations and conservative interpretations, these parables are often used to speak of God's judgment rather than God's love. There are interpretations of these parables I just listed saying that God separates the saved from the unsaved, that a deathbed conversion after a life of callous oppression is okay, and that leaving the conformity of the herd is considered a sin in need of saving. But those are just interpretations. And when reviewing the fullness of the message, I believe the power of love is a better guide than a power of hate in determining an interpretation. It matters what we use to guide our interpretations of Scripture. I lean strongly in the direction of love. For example, pastor and blogger Micah Edmondson wrote, in Matthew 25, Jesus describes true converts as being marked by a peculiar empathy toward the poor and the marginalized and the incarcerated. But he describes false converts as being outwardly religious, but marked by a peculiar callousness toward the poor, marginalized, and incarcerated. This is an interpretation I can work with. We are called to care for one another, to build a society in which we all can thrive, not just some, but all. We are called to denounce the idea that some people are disposable or unworthy. The last, the lost, and the least ought to be the barometer of where we spend our time and attention. We are called to be marked by a peculiar empathy. What does all this mean for us here in our little Binghamton congregation? What are we to do with this call to include all voices, to have empathy for the people on the margins? Well, think globally and act locally is one answer. Yes, there's a lot at stake with this Voting Rights Act up at Senate, but you and I are not senators. Our work is a little different. We can certainly agitate for change at those highest levels, but we can also be the change right here in our own lives and in our own neighborhoods. During her Where lecture this past summer, Stacey Abrams offered an insightful reframing of the dynamic at play here, where most of us, from a certain privileged perspective, see the poor, the marginalized, and the incarcerated as the last and the lost and the least. She saw them as the prayerful, the powerful, our protectors. She pushed us to see them not as lowly people in need, but as those with whom we could partner, the prayerful, the powerful, our protectors. Her suggestion that they are powerful is only accurate from a certain vantage point. But the other two qualities are resoundingly accurate, and from that certain vantage point, all three qualities are. The poor and marginalized people in our nation have a certain power, and they are certainly prayerful. That is often quite true. But I was most struck by that third attribute that Abrams put in her list. Consider her assertion that they are our protectors. She said she saw them as the prayerful, the powerful, and our protectors. I suspect Stacey Abrams finds her time serving the last and the lost and the least to be work that protects her. It protects her from growing callous, from growing jaded by the politics of the job, from losing her soul to the systems that strive to keep privileged people from caring about the poor. In this way, the vulnerable among us are our protectors. They keep our consciences sharp, lest we fall into denial and apathy. Over the years, I have preached a message about how we can use our privilege to serve justice. I've also preached a message about our brokenness, mine and yours, in the face of the difficulties of the world. When you combine those two, we are called to be marked by a peculiar empathy. We are called to see our neighbors in need as ourselves and to love them. We are called to be because we're better than anyone else, but because we too are in need. But many of us have certain privileges that help us weather the storms of life. In service, we step closer to one another. In service, we are protected from feeling better than others. In service, we share the dream of a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. On that brisk January Mourning nearly a year ago, the young poet Amanda Gorman reminded us of our goal as a nation. Our goal of what our nation can be when we live into our promise. She said, we will not march back to what was, but move to what shall be, a country that is bruised but whole, benevolent but bold, fierce and free. We will not be turned around or interrupted or intimidated, because we know our inaction and inertia will be the inheritance of the next generation. Our blunders become their burdens. But one thing is certain. If we merge mercy with might, she said, and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright. So let us leave behind a country better than the one we were left with. Every breath from my bronze pounded chest will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one. For that, my friends, we need all of our voices and all our beautiful diversity to be better together as a nation, as a people in service. We will climb this hill together. In a world without end, may it be so.